Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Coming up, 36,000 protesters rallied in Tokyo against a push to amend Japan's pacifist constitution. Seized ship and vessel attacks are pushing U.S.-Iran ceasefire towards a brink. Humanoid robots wins Beijing half marathon, defeating the human world record. And Britain is looking to European Union as the Iran war strains its ties with the United States. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. In Japan, tens of thousands of people have gathered at the Parliament building in Tokyo to protest the constitutional revision spearheaded by Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. Similar rallies have recently taken place across the country as the ruling Liberal Democratic Party pushes to amend Japan's post-war pacifist constitution. Demonstrators on Sunday also opposed the plans to deploy long-range missiles and ease restrictions on lethal weapons exports. The protest came after a Japanese warship transited the Taiwan Strait. China says it had monitored the vessel throughout its transit, accusing Japan of using this move to flex its military muscle and deliberately provoke trouble. So for more, joining us now on the line is Zoom Ahmed Khan, research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. So thank you very much for joining us today, Zoom. The protests we have seen in Japan recently, including this latest round over the past weekend, are, frankly speaking, quite large scale. Why do you think there is widespread opposition to attempts to amend the country's post-war constitution?
Thank you firstly for having me. We have been watching this situation unfold since November 7th, right? Last year, when initially Sanae Takaichi made her remarks of considering the Taiwan contingency as an existential threat to Japan. And I think that has, obviously this government's posture to build Japan towards being a more military power, which completely defeats the pacifist constitution of the country, which is the post-war identity of Japan, right? You have a generation that still remembers the scars, obviously the damage that Japanese militarism did to the region, and also the Japanese people as a consequence. And there, you don't have a consensus at this point, no matter how much the current government would like to push for a remilitarization, for a more, a posture that others definitely see as threatening in the region. The people simply do not want that. People want peace. They seem to want economic ties. They have seen their lives transform for the better with greater, connectivity with the region, with countries that they have wronged in the past. And now you see a lot of protests across the country. They simply do not want their government to pose these threats and to, potentially even get embroiled in conflicts like they have seen in other parts of the world. So the people have definitely spoken, and what we see is more than 70% oppose, vehemently oppose any such postures by the government.
Takaichi says she is seeking a one-year timeline for a constitutional amendment proposal. Realistically speaking, what do you make of the likelihoods that Japan might revise its constitution anytime soon?
First is the fact that the region, the domestic political opposition, and the people have spoken against any such revision of the Constitution, right? There is a backlash, and that's a small word for, what you see, especially the Japanese society has really, taken to the streets and spoken against any such amendment. And if we look at it, very from a very legal, from Japanese political, constitutional standpoint, what are the possibilities? Then actually it's very low, even for the next 1 to 3 years, even without all of this opposition. Takaichi can realistically deliver maybe a formal LTB proposal or a draft within 1 year, a 1 year target, which is, still far-fetched. And they do have a lower house supermajority. But the upper house minority, there are also coalition rifts. The support of the public is not there at all, and the opposition has spoken against it. Means that a referendum might be required at some point, and it's deeply unlikely given the current scenario. So it might be an ambitious plan for her. I don't know who she is trying to please with this position. It definitely is not the people of Japan or the region. But also, frankly, given the legal restrictions that they have, despite having the supermajority, seem to make it an unlikely, realization.
Some say Japan has already hollowed out the key Article 9 of the country's post-war pacifist constitution through either legislation or legal reinterpretation. What is your take on this?
This has been a process, right? We see the most, from my standpoint, a hawkish position in the current administration, right? But we also know that back in 2014, the Abe cabinet also reinterpreted, and in 2015, the security laws enabled some collective self-defense, a sense of collective self-defense, which was again a posture against the pure solely pacifist constitution. And then the 2022 National Defense Strategy and record defense budgets treat the SDF as a de facto normal military with offensive support capabilities, right? So I think, there is no doubt if we understand how Article 9 has been consistently reinterpreted, and especially now with the most provocative remarks of including Taiwan contingency in Japan's, existential threat scenario, it seems that that to a great extent, at least verbally, the article's principles have been hollowed out, and that is a tragedy. It's a tragedy for a region that has really, prospered with a sense of, collective sense of development, trust, economic ties, people-to-people ties. It was really an example for other regions to follow. But this direction does not seem promising in the medium to long term if it continues.
Do you believe Japan can better contribute to regional or international peace if it owns a so-called normal military?
So what is a normal military? I think one thing for us to note is that just look at the state of the world right now as it is, right? We almost went into what could have been World War III. We have seen so many conflicts, starting from the Middle East region. We have seen, obviously Europe is also in a situation that needs to be dealt with. I don't believe anyone will say that peace or understanding or diplomacy or lasting progress requires militarization. And the argument that some have made that Japan should have less of a pacifist constitution was under the premise of this so-called Quad, US-Japan, a potential AUKUS plus, kind of coalition. But we know that these coalitions do not support peace, do not support trust, do not support economic gains, do not support people's aspirations. And those arguments have fallen flat. So I think we also know that Trump 2.0 has not even mentioned these alliances yet, right? I think the support for such an argument is very, very thin, is almost non-existent. And what Japan really should be doing is maintaining the trust that has taken decades to build with regional partners, with countries like China, with South Korea, with other East Asian countries, be sincere to the spirit of ASEAN, which has always been about economic growth and ties that build trust and build opportunities, a sense of coexistence. So a so-called militarized Japan does not in any way contribute to that, and no country in the region will support it.
Now, Zoom, since you have mentioned about the possibility regarding a World War III, then why not let's talk about why don't we talk about history? I mean, World War II, Japan's wartime atrocity, Imperial Japan's wartime atrocity is well recorded by historical documents. But nowadays, it seems those ideologies or political talking points or sentiments surrounding a kind of historical denialism is
Yes.
on the rise. It is becoming a serious political talking point. It is entering the mainstream political theater in Japan. Why do you think this is the case?
I'm not sure, I mean, why there are multiple forces that do not want peace in actually, I would say, in around China. And that's just an unfortunate reality. China is on its way to becoming the largest economic power in the world. It is a global power already, and there are many forces that are working against that. Now, look at the double standard of this kind of positioning and the kind of denialism that's not only being encouraged within Japan, but is somehow being encouraged in some global fora as well. Imagine if Germany were to assume such a posture, what would Europe's reaction be? And why is a different, lens, or why is a different ethical code applied to Japan? It's something that we already know the answer. It's that some people deserve peace and some people simply do not, and that's a call that unfortunately some parts of the world have made for far too long, and today we are in a position to call them out. And today, what is also, I mean, I think it's good to see that the Japanese people, by and large, do not want to stand by such posturing because they do not see it benefiting them as people. They do not want to become the next, conflict zone. They do not want to be embroiled in another situation where their lives are impacted negatively and generations could suffer. They know what Japanese militarism was like, and as much as some forces are trying to erase that memory, it cannot be erased because the people of the region remember, and millions have suffered. There's still a lot the Japanese government needs to do to apologize, to recognize the mistakes of the past. And the last thing the Japanese government should be doing right now is to go in the opposite direction. So I think the double standard speaks volumes about how some people are treated lower than others, and how qualms and fears of some regions are treated as trivial, whereas others, are understood as, understandable, or those people's, security, the memory of the past is given more respect in their cases than others. So I feel Japan's ability, and some people, some global media are also trying to belittle the memory of Japan's past, and that does not work because the people of the region have spoken and they will not forget. What they want is normalization. They want peace. They want a country that has that ugly history to not go in the same direction again.
The final question before we let you go, Zoom. What is the danger of a Japanese warship transiting the Taiwan Strait? I mean, Japan's Marine Self-Defense Force was first reported to have sent a vessel through the Taiwan Strait back in 2024, and then conducted two more transits last year in 2025, and now we have seen the latest one. Does this move have anything to do with the self-defense of Japan?
No, I mean, absolutely not. And I think, we just had a successful visit by the opposition leader of the KMT, right, in China. And we see that there is hope for increased, connectivity and, revitalization of cross-strait relations. And I think the timing is bizarre, to say the least. What does the Taiwan question have to do with Japan's own security, self-defense, existential, a sense of, how could even potentially, like Sanae Takaichi said, a Taiwan contingency could make for an existential threat to the Japanese people? There is simply no answer. It's just a provocation. And the problem is that, again, it does not promote trust, peace, and normalization and betterment of ties between people across the region. So this is provocative, and the timing is extremely uncanny. And China has spoken against it. I think other parts of the world will also speak against it. The One China principle is a cornerstone of Chinese foreign policy. It is the premise of the bilateral relations that countries across the world have with Beijing. And to disrespect that and to act as a provocateur cannot be, of course, in Japan's own self-interest, but whose interest does it promote? This is something that we all need to think about.
Thank you very much for joining us. Zoom Ahmed Khan, Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. This is World Today. Stay tuned. You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Iran's foreign ministry says there is no plan for a second round of talks with Washington, contradicting U.S. President Donald Trump's claim that new negotiations will take place in Pakistan. Iranian media says Tehran rejected new talks due to what it calls Washington's excessive demands and the naval blockade. However, some reports suggest that Tehran has decided to continue with negotiations. In the meantime, Iran has vowed to retaliate after American forces seized an Iranian-flagged cargo ship near the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran has denounced the move as armed maritime piracy. So for more, joining us now on the line is Dr. Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Fudan University. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, first of all, how do you understand the message from Tehran that there is no plan for a fresh round of talks with Washington?
My observation is that before this new round of negotiations, the two sides are trying to send hardline signals to each other. And the purpose for Tehran at the moment is to show that it tries to reset the terms of engagement and protect its negotiating leverage, and tries to show that it's not very easy for Tehran to make significant compromises. In fact, in recent days, Trump has repeatedly stated in his social media, etc., that Iran accepts certain conditions set by the United States. But Iran has stated that this is not the case. So I think in essence, Iran is trying to signal at least three things. The first thing is that the ship seizure crossed a red line and eroded any remaining trust between the two sides. And the second issue here is that Iran will not negotiate under military pressure or while the blockade remains in place. And third, domestically, Tehran projects unity and strength ahead of the ceasefire expiry. So it tries to avoid any appearance of weakness after a high-profile issue at sea. So in general, I think Iran hopes to make concessions only if it is certain that the United States will fully commit to the war.
What do you make of the message that the United States wants to send by seizing this Iranian-flagged cargo ship?
I think the seizure of the cargo ship seems to be a calculated demonstration of the United States, of its so-called maximum pressure in action. This is a very typical tactic used by Donald Trump. Whenever he is in the process of negotiating with someone, he always believes that he could force the other party to make more concessions through the so-called maximum pressure. And currently, through this sort of actions, Washington is trying to send several signals to Tehran. For example, the United States tries to say it retains full military dominance in the Gulf region, and it will act decisively against any attempt to break the blockade. And also it tries to say that the ceasefire is not a free pass for Iran to resume normal maritime trade or oil exports. And also it tries to say that economic strangulation remains on the table until Iran accepts United States core demands. Also, I think it serves as a warning to shipping companies in third countries as it which tries to run a blockade, and the United States is making it very clear that if you try to do so, you may carry the real risk.
Judging from what happened after the seizure of this Iranian-flagged cargo ship, do you think Washington has made a wise move here?
In fact, so far we have already seen the side effects of this move. They are very evident. Among them is the oil price, because we can see that it has surged at least 5 to 6% overnight after the news was released. And also the ceasefire agreement is teetering on the brink, and mediators right now are busy negotiating, but it's very hard for the two sides to trust each other. And so this move reinforces Tehran's position, just as Washington is trying to project optimism for a new round of talks. So I think it narrows the diplomatic window, and also it increases the likelihood of miscalculation by the two sides before the ceasefire expires. So in general, I think Trump's style is, usually a combination of pressure and negotiation at the same time. But this sort of interception of the warships before the deadline seems to have backfired at the moment. And we can see that the Tehran hardliners already claim that they might withdraw from negotiations in response to such actions.
By the way, what do you think could happen to this seized cargo ship in the days ahead?
Well, I think it's very hard to tell, but there could be some different scenarios. For example, maybe there will be short-term detention and inspection at sea under the United States control in order to check for sanctioned cargo weapons or links to the Iranian Islamic Guard. And also the ship could be used as a bargaining chip by the United States, as Washington may offer its return or release of crew in exchange for Iranian compromises and concessions during any resumed indirect talks. And also, I think it is worth noting that there could be prolonged legal hold or eventual forfeiture if the vessel is tied to sanctioned companies. That could also happen. And last but not least, there could also be the scenario of escalation. Let's say if Iran launches credible retaliatory strikes on the United States or allied shipping, the ship could also become a flashpoint for further clashes. So in the end, I see that there are different scenarios. But right now, due to the very weak negotiations between the two sides, anything could happen, and there is still a very high risk of escalation of the conflict.
In a bigger picture sense, Dr. Zhang Zhichu, it appears that recently we have seen this really, I would say, rapid alternations between optimism and pessimism regarding the Iran conflict. For example, over the past weekend, there is already this kind of alternation between the two sides. Do you think this is something that is becoming a new normal for this conflict?
Well, it seems to be the case. And if you compare the conflicts in the past and the conflict right now, you can see a great difference. In the past, we often say that they lacked enough information, but right now there is just too much information. And right now we can see swift alternations, as you have just mentioned. And sometimes the politicians could even send different signals deliberately for different purpose. So right now, Trump uses public optimism and threats in tandem to keep Iran off balance and to force Iran to make a lot of concessions, whereas Iran tries to use rejection to extract sanctions relief or blockade relief in order to bargain with the United States. So now I expect more of the same to happen. That means maybe there is going to be, there would continue to be rapid swings between a deal imminent headlines and war imminent alerts. I think this kind of change and alternations reflects the absence of mutual trust between the two sides, since there lacks mutual trust between Iran and the United States, and with both sides declaring victory, it's very difficult for either side to compromise. So right now,
your point's well taken, but thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Zhang Chuchu joining us from Fudan University. You're listening to World Today. We'll be back.
Hello, my name is Alessandro Golombiewski Teixeira. I'm a professor of public policy and management at Tsinghua University in Beijing. I am a great listener of The World Today. In my opinion, The World Today is one of the best China radio programs. In The World Today, we can get the best news and analysis in what is happening now in the world. So please come to join us.
You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. China's humanoid robots are making a remarkable leap in endurance and autonomy. At the Beijing E-Town 2026 Humanoid Robot Half Marathon, an honor robot completed this race in about 48 minutes under controlled conditions. That was faster than the human half marathon world record. Just a year ago, the winning robot took more than 2.5 hours. About 40% of this year's participants used autonomous navigation rather than remote control, highlighting really rapid advances in terms of embodied artificial intelligence. So for more on this, my colleague Zhao Yang spoke with Andy Malk, a technology analyst and a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization.
So, Andy, what's your first reaction to seeing the humanoid robots performing this year compared to just 1 year ago? What's the technology leap, in their speed, autonomy, balance, and endurance, etc., etc.?
I would say my reaction is surprised and not surprised. So, first of all, maybe under we could call normal conditions, this is many years, maybe even a decade's worth of technological advancement. And, it's happened in 1 year. So, I think this is an enormous breakthrough and really shows the productivity and the power of China's system, which we can think of as, creating and adopting technology through governance, not just talent, not just capital, but governance. And I think this is really, again, why I say I am both surprised and not surprised.
We've seen the humanoid robots from Honor, Unitree, Tiangong. And so which sectors do you think are going to adopt them at scale first? Is that manufacturing, logistics, services, elder care, or what else?
Well, Jiayang, I think we will definitely see a progression here by sector. And I do want to point out that, what will, I think, play an important role in determining the order in which this is rolled out is, again, China's governing philosophy as well as its objectives. So in my book, I talk about this I-5 framework where China can go from idea to institutions, to instruments, to infrastructure, and then finally to impact. And what really matters is that how do you manage the transition from ideas to institutions and then institution to instruments, et cetera. So I think that, we see that we're still on the road to fully autonomous robots that can act efficiently and safely in very uncertain environments. So I think, the first sectors will be things like manufacturing, like logistics, because they are a more controlled environment. And then we'll move progressively to robots in, public spaces. I think in the home is probably the most challenging because the safety standards are, I think the highest there. And the unpredictability is also the highest. So I think we will go in the order you mentioned: manufacturing, logistics, maybe certain sectors of healthcare. And we may see something like the L1 to L5 model that we see in autonomous driving.
And what are still some of the obstacles for the commercialization of humanoid robots, do you think?
Well, if the endpoint is fully autonomous robots that can act just like humans in a physical environment, I think, at a big picture level, the big challenge is the brain, we could say, of the robot, that it can perceive, act uh, in uncertain situations, not predetermined situations. But here I want to point out again something very important about China's governance approach. So this competition, this half marathon had prizes, and this is, I think, not widely appreciated. Most competitions like this, the prize is usually money, a cash prize. But here's what China's doing differently. The top prize is at least 1 million RMB in orders, so basically a purchase order. And there are also prizes for endurance, gait, meaning the way a robot walks, perception, design. And this is very specifically mapped to a particular technical bottleneck that industry needs to solve. So again, what we see here is this I5 model in action. China has an idea. One of the biggest motivations for smart robots is that as China's population ages, there really needs to be other engines of productivity. And then, of course, that is turned into institutions, instruments, infrastructure, and then finally impact. And I see, these prizes as a very effective way of guiding all of these actors to solve technological bottlenecks that will be required for robots to be fully autonomous.
And what does a future with widespread humanoid robots look like in Chinese cities and factories?
Well, the utopian endpoint, or maybe that we call it the dream, is that robots can do anything and everything humans can do. So they can clean the streets, they can cook dinner, they can work in factories, work in hospitals, but maybe even more powerfully, they can work on making even better robots. So this is called recursive innovation. And if we do this enough times, the belief, or again, the dream is that robots can create everything we physically need: clothing, housing, food, transportation, etc., for very, very little cost, perhaps even free. And then this would bring in again a kind of a utopia of the sort that Karl Marx wrote about. So that would be, of course, not just an enormous technological breakthrough, but I think a very profound civilizational change.
And we are seeing companies like Honor, Xiaomi, and Alibaba all enter the robotic space. So what does this tell us about how China's tech ecosystem views robotics as a future growth driver?
Again, I think it all starts with government and governance. And what China does is it says, look, here's something very important we need to do. And it then creates the demand. And here it's very important to be careful in saying this, that what China is not doing is picking the winners, but what it is doing is creating enormous demand and then letting the market pick the winners. So this is, again, why we see all of these companies that, are not founded or initially primarily focused on robotics enter this space, because, again, they are responding to government leadership, to government incentives that are coordinating all of these players to address technological bottlenecks. But also, the next thing we have to solve are business models. Like, how should you charge for this? Is it as a service? Do you buy the robot and own the robot, et cetera? So again, I think this is, it's an exciting time, and we're seeing China take, again, this I5 model or playbook that it succeeded so spectacularly in electric vehicles, and now is replicating it with robots.
And how does China's progress in humanoid robots compare with other countries like United States and Japan?
Well, I think, China is, the only, certainly only major country that has this ability to integrate from idea to impact. Clearly, historically, the United States and Japan have led in technological breakthroughs in robotics, but not necessarily at systemically rolling them out at scale. And again, I think this is China's strength in that it not only is increasingly a global leader in just the pure R&D side of technology, but the ability to take these breakthroughs and then turn them into tangible benefit, not just at national scale, but I would say probably even global scale as well.
Andy Malk, Senior Research Fellow with the Center for China and Globalization, speaking with my colleague Zhao Yang. Coming up, Britain looks to Europe as the Iran war strains its ties with the United States. This is World Today. We'll be back. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. It is reported that Britain's government is set to announce legislation next month to move the country closer to the European Union. It comes as the Iran war sours the UK's relationship with the United States. AFP has reported that US President Donald Trump's unpredictability and insults towards Britain are adding impetus to Prime Minister Keir Starmer's bid to deepen ties with the European Union, a decade after Britain's narrowly voted to leave the bloc. Starmer's government is preparing an quote-unquote EU reset bill that would give ministers the power to align UK standards with the EU single market rules. The European Union represents Britain's largest trading partner. The International Monetary Fund has warned that among the advanced economies, Britain will be the hardest hit by the ongoing Iran conflict. So for more on this, my colleague Do Hongyu spoke with Dr. Kamal Makili Aliyev, Associate Professor at the School of Global Studies with the University of Gothenburg.
Dr. Aliyev, what do you think of Britain's EU reset bill that will allow ministers to align UK standards with EU single market rules? And how can it mitigate the economic damage caused by the current Middle East conflict?
Well, the proposed reset bill is economically pragmatic rather than politically transformative, I would say. I think at its core, it allows the UK to dynamically align with EU single market rules. That reduces regulatory friction and improves trade flows with its largest economic partner, namely the European Union. And in the context of Iran conflict, I think this matters a lot because the UK is highly exposed to the energy price shocks and supply chain disruptions. This is very clear. Also, there is an International Monetary Fund's warning that it would be one of the hardest hit advanced economies. So the close alignment with the EU can help UK stabilize trade and investment flows. It can reduce transaction costs for businesses. This is very important for UK, and also provide a more predictable economic environment. However, I don't think it can fully offset the shock. It is a buffer, not a solution to global geopolitical disruption.
Actually, Starmer has repeatedly called for a deeper economic and security relationship with Europe since his Labour Party won the 2024 general election. So how might recent tensions between the UK and the United States accelerated this agenda?
Yes, I think it's very important distinction, right? The tensions with Donald Trump, they clearly accelerated but not created this shift. The shift was already in the books even before Trump and Starmer have been in power. But Keir Starmer already campaigned on rebuilding EU ties before he came to the post of a prime minister. And recent developments, I think they reinforced the urgency because US policy has become more unpredictable and very transactional. There are also disagreements over the Iran conflict that expose strategic divergence between UK and the United States. There are also reports of political friction, and rhetoric has weakened the trust. So in this kind of environment, UK is diversifying or hedging, if you will, to deepen economic ties and integration with Europe. and rebuild security cooperation with EU partners. This is very important as opposed to the United States. So this is less about abandoning the United States as a partner. It's more of reducing over dependence on it, which was very clear for UK.
And then, Doctor, how might closer UK-EU ties affect Britain's global positioning, especially its long-standing position as a bridge between the United States and Europe?
I think this is one of the most significant long-term parts of the shift. We know that for decades, UK's strategic identity, it rested on being sort of a bridge between the United States and Europe. But closer EU alignment, it complicates this role. First of all, the reset, if you can call it that, it deepens several positions that for the UK. One, the UK becomes more embedded in the European economic and regulatory space, from which it tried to separate through Brexit. At the same time, its diplomatic posture, it shifts from a transatlantic intermediary to more kind of European aligned power with global reach. So that said, UK will still try to maintain very much strong intelligence and defense tie with the United States. It's still very much dependent on the US security provision. And I think it's going to maintain its role in NATO and in global diplomacy. So the bridge role won't disappear, but it will become less balanced and more Europe-leaning.
And as the UK further distances itself from the US-led military action against Iran, as we know, how might this shift influence Washington's strategic calculations in the Middle East? And what ripple effects could it have on US alliances in Europe and the Middle East?
Well, I think it's an excellent question because from Washington's perspective, this is a warning signal very clearly. If even the UK, one of the traditionally closest US allies, is trying to distance itself from the US-led military actions and at the same time realigning itself economically with Europe, then that means that the US faces reduced operational flexibility in coalition building, for example, for its actions, as well as greater difficulty in, well, let's say, securing automatic allied support. We've already seen that in the case of Iran. And in the Middle East specifically, it may need to rely more on regional partners rather than the European ones. We already started to see the signs of that. Or it should accept more fragmented coalitions, with some countries more or less behind it and some countries that were traditional allies are not. Think of example of Spain. So more broadly, I think it reinforces the trend. US alliances are becoming more conditional and interest-based rather than automatic like we used to perceive it and think about them.
And looking beyond Europe and the Middle East, with countries such as Canada, the European Union members, and other US partners increasingly reevaluating their security and diplomatic ties with the United States amid the Middle East turmoil, how will this affect the broader international order and transatlantic cohesion?
Well, we're witnessing a very evident, gradual, but significant transformation. Across the board, we see European countries that are asserting more strategic autonomy very clearly. We see partners like you named Canada and others that are reassessing dependence on the US leadership, Canada, UK, great examples. There is also growing discomfort with unilateral or unpredictable US actions. Again, the example of Spain. So I think all this doesn't mean that there is a collapse of the transatlantic alliance. I have to make sure I say that. But at the same time, that does mean less cohesion among the Western partners. More issue-by-issue cooperation is going to be on the books from now on. It's going to be a shift toward a more multipolar Western alliance or Western bloc. In effect, the West is no longer, acting as a single unifying actor, but more like a coalition of aligned but increasingly independent players. I think United States President Donald Trump is clearly against the existing distancing that the Europe and the UK have demonstrated in this kind of a broader shift that we're going to be witnessing. He's going to be applying pressure on NATO through its institutions. He's going to be trying to pressure the allies with the trade policies, but he is still very much bogged down in the Iran conflict for these practices and the policies to become a reality in any observable short term. Because for Donald Trump right now, this is not something that he can afford of doing before he has resolved the Iran conflict dynamics, because for right now it seems to be a stalemate, and that is going to be distracting the president from the relations with strategic partners and even dealing with such negative trends for the US as distancing of Europe and UK.
Kamal Makili Aliyev, Associate Professor with the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg, speaking with my colleague Dou Hongyu. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Now let's turn to the National Endowment for Democracy, or the NED, in the United States. In its annual report released earlier this year, the organization says it increased the support for networks focused on China in 2025. The report also vows that China-related programs will remain the NED's single largest area of investment in 2026. Despite it being a self-proclaimed non-governmental organization, the NED depends heavily on funding from the U.S. government and is widely regarded as aligned with Washington's foreign policy objectives. According to data released on its website in 2020, it provided over $10 million in grants for 69 China-related programs within a single year to support activities aimed at undermining China's stability. So for more, joining us now on the line is Han Hua, co-founder and Secretary General of Beijing Club for International Dialogue. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So we know the NED was established back in 1983. How does its track record look like over the past 4 decades and more? Some say it has long operated as a second CIA. What is your take?
Well, you just mentioned that there have been over 69 programs within 1 year focusing on China. So we know that the NED was created during the Cold War as part of a broader effort in how the United States pursued ideological competition with the Soviet Union. While NED presents itself as an NGO, its funding structure, largely sponsored by the US Congress, means it operates in close alignment with US strategic agenda, which is to promote US democracy worldwide. So over the past 4 decades, as we know, its activities have been closely associated with political transitions and civil society movements in regions ranging from Eastern Europe to Latin America and parts of Asia. So supporters argue this reflects democracy promotion. Critics point out that its involvement often coincides with moments of political instability in countries not aligned with Washington. So the comparison to the Central Intelligence Agency, which is CIA, may not be entirely linear, but it captures a widely held perception that the NED serves as a more institutionalized instrument of influence. So in this sense, the debate is less about whether it is another CIA, but more about whether its activities respect the sovereignty, the internal political processes within the other countries.
So why do you think China has long been a primary focus of this organization's, say, infiltration and subversive activities?
Well, you see, China's CPC governance and its achievements, people-centered policies, reflect both its scale and its strategic significance in our own country. So as the world's second largest economy and a country offering a distinct development model, China represents not just a geopolitical competitor, but also an alternative narrative, alternative solution to Western liberal democracy. So for institutionals like the NED, this creates both strategic and ideological incentives for them to compare and to pursue their own agenda. So on one hand, engaging China-related issues fits into a broader U.S. approach to long-term competition. On the other, there is a belief, particularly in Washington policy circles, that influencing discourse within and around China should shape its future trajectory. So it is also worth noting that many of these programs operate not only within China-related contexts, but also among diaspora communities, media platforms, especially in the current day social media platforms, and academic networks globally. So this suggests that the focus is not purely domestic, but part of a wider effort to shape the international perceptions and the global narratives about China. So this is what we should pay more attention to.
I guess it's pretty important to note here that when the NED's report mentions about China, it actually refers China's mainland as a term that is separate from Tibet. Of course, when we talk about Tibet in Chinese term, we call it Xizang nowadays. And it even openly mentions this term East Turkestan. What do you think its wording here tells us about the organization's real stance on China?
Well, I'm not a linguist, but I would say that, in my opinion, language and the terminology about this China, mainland China, Tibet, even East Turkestan, as you mentioned, is never neutral in geopolitics. The choice to differentiate China from regions, our own regions, such as Xizang, or to use terms like Eastern Turkestan, reflects a deep and particular political framing. So such wording aligns with narratives that question or challenge China's sovereignty, challenging China's territorial and the governance framework. From Beijing's perspective, this touches directly on issues of sovereignty, of our territorial integrity, which are considered core national interests. So more broadly, this kind of terminology indicates that the organization is not simply promoting abstract democratic values, but is engaging in discourse that intersects with highly sensitive political questions, that inevitably reinforces the perception that its work is not neutral, but embedded in a specific geopolitical agenda.
Finally, let's take a look at its official name, the National Endowment for Democracy. I mean, do you think the promotion of democracy is still something appealing to the world today, especially to the wide global South community?
Certainly not to me, definitely not appealing globally. And across much of the global South, there is a growing skepticism toward externally driven models of governance, particularly when they are perceived as selective or instrumentalized. Many countries are increasingly prioritize their own agenda, including but not limited to stability, people-centered development, policy autonomy, over adopting any single prescribed political model or their so-called Western formula. At the same time, the global conversation or global dialogue is shifting from which system is superior to which system delivers, which system can deliver the best interests to its own people. So governance legitimacy today is often judged less by ideological labels, but more about outcomes, like I said, delivery, the economic resilience over the ever-turbulent geopolitical tensions, the social cohesion, and the state capacity. So in this sense, the challenging for organizations like the NDPD is that the international environment has totally changed.
That's for sure. But thank you very much for joining us. Han Hua, co-founder of Beijing Club for International Dialogue. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. I'm Ding Han in Beijing. Bye for now.